Time now for the political analysis of Fromm and Fuller. Al Fromm, former political advisor to President Bill Clinton, and Craig Fuller, former political advisor to both President Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush. Good morning, all. Hey, Al, your friend Craig Fuller penned a column in The Spy yesterday, which noted the high price that House Republican leader McCarthy is going to be paying for giving Liz Cheney the heave-ho yesterday morning. It seems like McCarthy has made Cheney into a GOP martyr of sorts. You've watched both parties reinvent themselves, but this looks like a real divorce. What's your take?
Well, first of all, I admire what Liz Cheney has done. She's told the truth. She stood up for the Constitution and for the democratic process at a time when, if you believe the polls, 70% of her party wants to bring them down by overturning the last election. And she's shown the courage not to back down in the face of a really incredible assault, bogus assault by the former president and Kevin McCarthy, the leader of her party in the House. But despite all the hype, telling the truth is a pretty low bar. We ought to expect that any member of Congress who swears an oath to uphold the Constitution will tell the truth when our democracy is at stake. Craig did a piece yesterday that said that Liz Cheney has unlimited options, many routes she can go in either the public or private sector. I'm sure that's right, but I don't see her having much success as redefining the Republican Party. You know, I had the experience of trying to rebuild a party that had suffered the three worst consecutive losses, at least in terms of electoral college votes won, of any political party in the history of our country since the advent of modern parties in 1828. So I have some sense of what's necessary to rebuild a party. And I just don't see how Liz Cheney can rebuild that party right now. She represents a small minority of a declining minority party. When we started our rebuilding, the liberals in our party made the noise and they got the press and they dominated the media. But 2/3 of rank and file Democrats said they were moderate or conservative. So we had a marketplace. We believed if we could develop an agenda that talked to them, we could both win a nomination, which you got to do because you can't get into a general election unless you win a nomination, and then win the presidency. 70% of Liz Cheney's party right now believes Donald Trump. They believe that he won the election. So where do you go? How do you rebuild the party? There were really three keys to our strategy to rebuild the Democratic Party after Craig and his Republicans decimated it in the 1980s. First was reality therapy. The second was developing strong young leadership. And third was building a core of ideas that voters wanted to support. So the party stood for something. Let's start with reality therapy. Our challenge was to understand why we were losing. We kept trying to repeat the same old strategies. So what do? We did a study, we called it the politics of evasion. Well, and what we kept doing was evading the truth about why we're losing. And so we'd keep going with the wrong strategies. Republicans are overloaded with evasion. I mean, Kevin McCarthy's a personal case study in evasion. He started yesterday by ousting Liz Cheney for being honest about the election from the leadership. He then had his troops in hearings on January 6th deny it happened, say it was just like ordinary tourists walking through the Capitol when there are rioters and insurrectionists trying to bring down our democracy. And everybody saw it. And then he goes to the White House and he says, you know, Biden's really the legitimate president. I just met with the president. I mean, what's with this guy? Uh, there were two myths that killed us, that were killing us in the 80s. One was, we called it the myth of liberal fundamentalism. And that was that if we were only more liberal, then we'd get more votes. Well, that sure sounds like the Trump people to me. And the second one was the myth of mobilization. Now, you got to understand that in the 1980s, the demographics of the country were different than they are now. But the idea was, if we just mobilized, minority voters and the liberals, then and got them all out to vote, then we'd win. Well, in those days, minority voters were about 10 or 12% of the electorate. The liberals were 15 or 20%. And so you'd get what we got in the high 30s, low 40s. And we had to, by careful analysis, using census data, using polling, using electoral results, we had to convince our party to change. Well, that sure sounds like where the Republicans are. If we just get more of those Trumpies out, we're going to win. The second thing was leadership. We had a group of young members of the House and Senate, including Clinton and Gore and Biden and Dick Gephardt and Bruce Babbitt, a couple others, Sam Nunn and Chuck Robb, all of whom wanted to be president. But they understood that if they didn't fix their party, none of them would be president. So they had an incentive to work together to change the party. I don't see that on the Republican side. I mean, Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger are great, but I just don't see that core of young leadership that's ready to take over and go outside the party and around it to come back and capture the party. And finally, we had an agenda. It became known as the New Democratic Agenda. It was developed over 4 or 5 years by governors and senators and House members and local officials. And it was pretty compelling agenda. The Republicans couldn't even get a platform at their last convention. They stand for nothing. What does this party stand for? The Liz Cheney fight wasn't over issues. I mean, if she's much more like an old-fashioned Republican than the woman who replaced her. The Republicans have become a party. They're really not a party. They're a cult of personality. They've been built around Donald Trump. He's a loser, but he's got control of the state party. He certainly has control of the congressional caucus at this time. If Liz Cheney's challenge is to figure out how to get around all of that, and right now, at least in my view, I don't see a path for her to do it in the Republican Party.
Craig, is there a path to make the Republicans come back together, or are we looking at a divorce?
Well, I think there is a path. I think it's actually one that Al is quite familiar with, but it begins where he began in that description, with a series of defeats. And at this point, I don't think the Republicans have probably suffered the kind of defeats that are going to change people's minds. What I was trying to point out the other day is that Liz Cheney, a conservative, principled member of Congress who has a worldview developed by a number of activities engaged in throughout the world, came to this crossroads, not because her political philosophy changed, but because she just simply insists on telling the truth and supporting her constitutional responsibilities. I think in the long run, that sort of principled individual is going to win the day. What is remarkable to me is that there are members of Congress, including the leader of the Republican House, Kevin McCarthy, who still wish to maintain an alliance with Donald Trump. And there's one thing we know about Donald Trump, it's that he only cares about one person, Donald Trump. And those who were casting their lot with him, I have to believe are going to be disappointed. They're going to be disappointed either because Donald Trump is distracted by court appearances or maybe even a conviction for some of his activities. It's just hard to imagine in a year and a half he's going to be, let alone 3.5 years, he's going to be a real active partisan supporting these Republicans. As a matter of fact, until he got elected president, his own philosophy and thinking on public policy wasn't even consistent with the Republican Party. So we've been taken down a path by someone who certainly appealed to a high percentage of Republicans, who certainly promised change and brought change of a kind. I just don't think it's going to be lasting change. And so what I'm more interested in is really seeking out those people who can, in fact, do what Al did, and that's begin to gather people who see a common objective, and that's to win elections and to advance a way of thinking that is more familiar to the Republican Party than perhaps what we have. I think the electorate out there is very confused. I started my day looking at a reply to a Facebook post. I posted the piece and also Liz Cheney's very fine remarks from the floor of the House, and I got a blast back. Actually, it's pretty thoughtful, but it was a blast back from someone who said, well, you must be a liberal because you're showing CNN. Well, the CNN was, yes, on the picture, but it was a live feed that they had broadcast of Liz Cheney's remarks. But somehow in this person's mind, you couldn't trust the live feed because it came from CNN. And then he thought, I must be liberal because Donald Trump is more conservative than Ronald Reagan. At that point, I decided probably engagement wasn't going to be fruitful on Facebook, but it represents, what we're up against. And until people see that the path that Donald Trump and those who support him have taken us down or are taking us down, and until it leads to actual loss at the polls, I don't know that we're going to turn it around. And I think Al's perspective is a very valuable one. It takes years to get this accomplished. It does take a larger number, that's for sure. But I have a feeling that we'll see larger numbers of Republicans looking for an alternative when they find that Donald Trump is not going to really be effectively standing with them in the months and years to come.
Craig said something really important. I mean, Republicans really have to have solid defeats. Because the third myth of our politics of evasion was the myth of the congressional bastion, which the ideal was, they said, well, if, we may not win the presidency, but we'll keep the Congress forever. Because if you remember in 1988, we had Republican or Democratic Senate, Democratic House, I believe, and certainly had the House. And of course, that didn't last either, because eventually the congressional vote catches up with the presidential vote. I hope there's a way to save the Republican Party, because this country needs two strong competing political parties, and they need to compete on the basis of ideas. And to me, having a strong Republican Party helps the Democrats avoid going off the deep end on their side. And it makes it possible, one, for us to be stronger politically, but secondly, for the country to solve its problems more easily, because you have people from both sides involved.
If you watch the news and you watch what's happening, swirling around Kevin McCarthy and Liz Cheney, you're looking at something that a very small percentage of the American people pay any attention to. I doubt that 0.1% could name the third ranking Republican in the House of Representatives over the past few years. Liz Cheney has an interesting future ahead of her one way or another. And like her father, who went on to be the Secretary of Defense, run a major corporation for a number of years and then become vice president, leaving the House of Representatives wasn't the worst thing to happen. I'm not suggesting Liz Cheney's decided to leave the House of Representatives. I think she has a a national platform the likes of which she could not have imagined just a few months ago. Ironically, winning the vote among her Republican colleagues to stay in that number 3 slot got her very little in terms of national recognition. Losing the seat has given her a platform from which she can do many things, whether it's seek public office or lead a large not-for-profit organization, or there's just many things I think that are available to her. I don't think that Kevin McCarthy has that luxury. I suspect if Liz Cheney is going to try to keep Donald Trump out of the White House, my guess is she's also going to keep Kevin McCarthy from the speaker's chair. And I'm not sure what his options are. So I think that we've got time that we're going to have to work through this. But over time, I have a feeling the pendulum, as it usually does in Washington, will swing back a little bit more towards the middle.
With all due respect, I don't know if I've got the complete answer I was looking for regarding the divorce and whether or not there could be, in essence, a split between big lie Republicans and the 30 to 40% that are getting increasingly frustrated by this dynamic. I mean, is that folly to think that?
My view would be that a divorce where people leave the Republican Party who are frustrated is not going to be the solution. Third parties tend not to fare well. I think the model of reform that Al really created for the Democrats is an ideal one. I think you have to do this from within the party, but it's like trying to help somebody who doesn't know they need help. Until they know they need help, it's hard to be successful. But I do think there's a block of Republicans, and I think it will grow, who want to find and chart a different path. I'm not going to suggest it's going to happen in the near term. I suspect we go through the midterm elections. We might have to go through another national presidential election in 2024. But I just don't think the path we're on makes any sense or has the prospect of long-term success as a Republican Party. But I hope that reform comes from within the party and not have good people simply leave it out of frustration.
If I were Liz Cheney, I'd call Larry Hogan and I'd call and say, let's get these governors together. They have to govern in the real world. They can't sit here with this phony nonsense. And let's put together a little group, and over the next 4 months, 5 months, before the end of the year, let's come up with 3 ideas that a Republican can run on in 2024. You can build your campaign if you want. If I decide to run, I'll do that. But for this point, let's work together. I mean, I can't tell you how valuable the 2 years, 1986 and 1987, before everybody went off and ran their own individual campaigns, even though a lot of these guys were planning them, were because it gave a chance to develop a common core of principles. So when one of them emerged, they had a core base of support. Now, it didn't happen, it didn't happen in 88, but it did happen in 92. And those things don't happen because they don't happen overnight. But that's what I'd do. I'd get on that phone to Larry Hogan and I'd say, Larry, get your 5 best governors. I'll find 5 people in the House. We'll get 5 senators, and let's start meeting and coming up with an agenda for the Republicans.
Well, I'm afraid that's all the time we have today. Al Fromm, Craig Fuller, thanks so much indeed. We'll see you next week.